Study in the Synoptic Gospels. Let's begin with the Synoptic Problem. First of all, synoptic comes from the word sun, meaning together, and optic, having to do with to see. So the question is, how do we explain the remarkable similarities and differences in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? That is, these three Gospels that see the story of Jesus together have remarkable similarities, but they also have remarkable differences. This is sort of like the question that a professor might have, trying to figure out how three people in the class may have taken a test together. Who was sitting where? How did one person possibly copy from another? Or did they simply know the same material so well? What can account for the remarkable similarities and differences? Sometimes people give a quick answer to that based on their authority of Scripture. Well, of course there would be similarities. God inspired them. The first response to that would have to do with the fact that there are not only similarities but differences. And then the second response, the level of response to such a comment would be, well, yes, of course there are similarities. There are similarities that have to do with the same content, the same way of telling stories, and so on. But the kind of similarities we're talking about are similarities at the level of actual wording. The same words, the same word order, sometimes the same arrangement of one story after another, and then at the same time, the same story told in the same way with the same words appears in very different places in the Gospels. So what is really going on here? And what we're going to discover is that an answer to such a question has to do with literary dependence between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The answer that we're going to find in this lecture is that there is a literary relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The church for many centuries believed that Matthew wrote first. Starting in the Enlightenment period, the question was asked afresh, and it took some time before an answer that has been quite satisfactory to New Testament scholarship was put forward. The answer known as the four-document hypothesis. Early in the 20th century, scholars particularly associated with Oxford University and a scholar by the name of B.H. Streeter came up with the four-document hypothesis. The hypothesis turned the traditional view of the church on its head in that Matthew is now seen as dependent on Mark's Gospel, and then also dependent on another source known as Q, which of course doesn't exist anywhere, but is a hypothetical source. And then some other sources need to be discussed in the four-document hypothesis. One is called M. That would be material only found in Matthew. And the other is called L, material only found in Luke. Q is a hypothetical source that Matthew and Luke both used. They had it in common. But Matthew didn't know Luke's gospel, and Luke didn't know Matthew's gospel. So Matthew and Luke used Q independently, just as they used Mark's gospel independently as a source. Look at this with some more detail. Mark's gospel contains 662 verses. Matthew uses almost all of those 662 verses. He uses 609 verses, whereas Luke uses about 350 verses from Mark's gospel. The other thing to note is that both Matthew and Luke reduce those verses from Mark's Gospel. Luke only reduces them slightly, from 350 to 325 verses in his Gospel. But Matthew reduces Mark considerably, from 609 verses to 523 verses. Q is this hypothetical source that Matthew and Luke had in common that comprises about 200 verses in the two Gospels. 200 verses in Matthew and Luke are thought to come from a source called Q. And then there's other material, as we said, M for Matthew, unique material, and L for Luke's unique material. So, for example, in Mark's Gospel, we have the parable of the wicked tenants. And that parable is also to be found in Matthew and Luke. But only in Matthew and Luke do we have the parable of the lost sheep. That parable is not found in Mark, and so it would be called a Q parable. Now, the infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke have lots of similarities, but they are examples of M and L material because they are neither from Q nor are they from Mark. So, for example, the story of the Magi coming to the baby Jesus in Bethlehem would be considered M material, whereas the story of the shepherds coming to Jesus in Bethlehem is considered L material, only found in Luke's Gospel. Let's have a look at a story that is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it's time to introduce you to the word pericope, spelt like the word periscope but without the S. And be careful with your spell checks when you write that word because pericope is often corrected automatically in spell check programs to periscope. Pericope. A pericope is a self-contained unit in the Gospels. It's, for example, one of the parables or one of the miracles in the Gospels. So here we have the pericope of the paralytic, the healing of the paralytic. Now, we have three columns here, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where they tell the story similarly. And as you look at this story in parallel, note the different colors. If something is in red, in this particular case, that means that the story is to be found in Matthew and Mark only. If something is in purple, that means that we find that particular wording in Matthew and Luke only. And if something is in green, that means that it is found only in Mark and Luke. And finally, if something is in blue, that means that we have similarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three. So as we analyze this, we can see that we have some examples of each of these as we read through. But obviously, blue is the predominant color here. So on the for-document hypothesis, what we would say is that Matthew and Luke have used mostly Mark in telling the story. Now, there's not enough purple to argue that Q is behind this story at all. It may be simply that the changes that Matthew and Luke made to Mark's Gospel were simply changes that occurred to both of them by the frequency of a particular word, for example. So when Matthew says in verse 2 that the paralytic was lying on a bed, then and we find that in Luke's Gospel, we find on a bed, it just might be that they independently preferred that kind of language. And the other example is in verse 7 in Matthew and verse 25 in Luke, where went home is in purple. Now, the language of in green, where Luke follows Mark, here is to be found in Luke verses 21 and 22. And this is not too significant in the sense that there's a lot of it, but it does show some literary dependence that Luke has with Mark that Matthew doesn't have, and similarly with the red, that Matthew follows Mark carefully with some wording on a few occasions here. So this illustrates primarily the example of Matthew, Mark, and Luke being in common, and the hypothesis is that it's because Matthew and Luke have independently used Mark's gospel. The same kind of analysis can be done where Mark drops out. And so on this next slide, we have some of the teaching of John the Baptist that is found only in Matthew and Luke, and not in Mark at all. And notice that we have quite a bit of overlap between Matthew and Luke. So we obviously can't explain this in terms of borrowing from Mark. We have to assume that there's some other source that they have in common. Now let me just stop here for a second and talk about the kind of similarities that we need to note. Because what we're looking at here is English translation. And obviously the Gospels are not written in English, but in Greek. But moreover, the language that Jesus would have used would have been Aramaic. So we're looking at an English translation of a Greek, several Greek accounts of a story, whereas the actual language that would have been used was Aramaic, wherever anyone is quoted. Now, when you find this kind of literary similarity in a translation that is in Greek, then that means that there must be a literary relationship, because people translate texts differently. Also, we have to note that in Greek, word order is not as important as in English. If I say, the dog bit the cat, that's very different from saying the cat bit the dog. But in Greek, it wouldn't matter what order you put those words, because the subject would have a certain ending and the object would have a certain ending, so that you would know which was the subject and which was the object. Given that you can move words around more freely then in terms of word order in Greek, when we find word order the same in two Greek documents, then we say there's a literary dependence as well. We're not using Greek in this course, so you just have to accept that indeed word order is part of the discussion here. So we have translation that has similarities. We have word order similarities. We also have the same words being used. Sometimes there are several words for the same idea, but when sources use the same word, then we could say, well, that suggests literary dependence as well. We could also go on to look at how the stories themselves, the pericopes throughout the Gospels, are laid out in similar patterns, where one pericope follows another pericope, and it's the same order in a different Gospel. Now remember, part of the Synoptic Problem is that there are also remarkable differences. And so when suddenly a pericope that is in common between two or three Gospels appears in a very different place in the Gospels, then what we have to say is that one of the Gospel writers is purposefully moving the story to another place, and we have to ask why. Now this leads us to one of the important issues uh, behind this brief survey of the synoptic problem and the four-document hypothesis, and that is that we're not just interested in the fact that there is literary dependence. We're not just interested in this kind of literary relationship, but we need to ask questions about why. Why do we have these stories with their similarities and differences? And it's in the differences in particular that we can learn things about the Gospels. God in His wisdom didn't give us one Gospel, but He gave us four Gospels. And by asking about the differences between the Gospels, we begin to appreciate why we have four Gospels. Toward the second part of the 2nd century, someone named Tatian came up with what we call a diatessaron. That is, a gospel that was formed from the four Gospels. He used the four Gospels as sources and created a single gospel. This had quite some popularity in the church, and there was some danger of moving towards this is our singular gospel in the New Testament instead of having four Gospels. Muslims critique Christians for having four Gospels. They say you don't have the same story. They got different stories. There's some differences and some problems that arise from those differences. But as we ask questions about the differences in our four Gospels, we begin to discover that this is a great benefit. And the benefit is that what we have is interpretation of the stories. By moving stories around, by some word changes, by adding stories or subtracting stories and telling the story differently, what we end up with is a preaching of the story of Jesus by Matthew and by Mark and by Luke and by John. We get four different interpretations of Jesus. Had God wanted to, He could have created such a situation in the first century that they would have developed very far in the area of technology, and what could have happened was the disciples may have been a film crew and taken pictures of Jesus with video. And what we could do in churches today, these 2,000 years later, is pop in copies of the original videos and watch them in our church service and watch an incident of Jesus healing somebody, and then we could have a discussion about it. But that's not what God gave us. God gave us not only historical eyewitness testimonies as to what happened, but He also gave us Matthew's interpretation or Luke's interpretation of the story of Jesus, so that today we're not responsible for putting a new interpretation on the events of the Gospels, but what we're called to do is to proclaim the interpretation that we find in the different Gospel writers. Only by paying attention to the differences between the Gospels can we accomplish that. Now, there is a tendency in many instances of preaching for people to try to reconstruct the original situation. Sometimes they'll look at the different Gospels and come up with their own way of telling what actually happened, rather than preaching what Matthew says happened or what Luke says happened. And that is like trying to go back to the video example that I gave, where the preacher reconstructs what happened and then gives his or her own interpretation of what happened. And this, I would suggest, is not at all what God wanted us to do with His Word. The Word is the Word of God. what's authoritative is not our reconstruction of what happened, but what's authoritative is what Matthew is preaching or teaching, what Luke is preaching or teaching with the story. And that should be our goal in interpretation and in proclamation, in teaching and in preaching. So, as we pay attention to these things, we need to look at the similarities and differences, not just from the question of the literary relationships between the Synoptic Gospels, but also the theological similarities and differences that emerge as we explore the pericope one after the other. And what hasn't been shown here in our slides is how pericopes are related to one another. We can have opportunity perhaps to look at this at a later lecture, but all we've done is looked at similarities within a particular lecture and noted that there is a literary relationship. There are some other views about the literary relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. A very small minority of scholars have raised, have suggested perhaps that Matthew really was written first, for example, and that Mark abridged Matthew. That's the kind of interpretation that might fit with the history of the church. We could look at different suggestions and need to if we're going to give a fuller lecture along these lines. But what I would like to convey is that the majority of scholars, the vast majority of scholars for the past 100 years have taught something along the lines of a four-document hypothesis. One final thing to note before we conclude this lecture, and that is a word about Q once again. Remember, on the slide we have right before us, we're illustrating a literary relationship in material where Mark is not present. We're calling that Q. But a lot of what comprises those 200 or so verses that people talk about as Q is also material that doesn't have this level of literary relationship. An example is the parable of the talents. When you compare Matthew and Luke on the parable of the talents, there's hardly any wording that is in common at all. That kind of an example could be explained simply in terms of Matthew and Luke having heard from different sources the story. Matthew, if he is the disciple of Jesus, which I think he is, then Matthew would have been perhaps just recording what he remembered Jesus to have said on that occasion. And Luke would have had some eyewitness testimony about that separately. We don't have to call that Q. So we have to be very careful about saying that Q was a single document. It was a written document that Matthew and Luke had. What we can say is that there's something other than Mark that was written down that Matthew and Luke used independently. And most likely it isn't all of those 200 verses. There have been some scholars in more recent times that have tried to talk about Q not only as a document, but as a document by a particular community with a particular theology. And so this idea of a Q community has been proposed by scholars, and always in a radical way. That is, the suggestion is that the Q community existed very early on, produced their work before Mark's Gospel was even written, produced it probably in the 50s, the argument goes, and that they didn't really see Jesus' death as very significant, and they didn't believe in Jesus' resurrection. That's because when we look at Q material, we don't find Q present in the passion narratives of Jesus, in the Gospels. So they say, well, therefore Q didn't have this. But if we talk about Q in a much more reduced sense, that it is not a lengthy document, it is not a full presentation of Jesus' ministry. It contains mostly the sayings of Jesus, things he had said, and not so much narrative stories about Jesus. Then it's very dangerous to talk about it as having a theology at all. It has recorded some of the stories of what Jesus said, but what it doesn't have does not mean that they didn't believe those things. It's a very wild conjecture, but it's been held by some prominent scholars and therefore has had some popularity in certain circles. I think that's about all we need to say in terms of the issues around the synoptic problem and the four-document hypothesis. So let's conclude with some questions. What does it mean to have literary relationships between the synoptics? We've talked about the literary and the theological relationships between the synoptic gospels. So from a literary perspective, we note that the gospel writers have editorial freedom. They can move stories around, they can place them at different points in the gospel story, in the gospel narrative. They can change the wording somewhat. And that freedom, though, it doesn't mean that there's inconsistency, but rather they have editorial freedom and consistency. And theological emphases need to be examined when you look at the similarities and differences in the Gospels. Look for where the differences are and ask, why is that change made? And sometimes you find some theological emphases. It may be that Matthew's adding a quotation from the Old Testament and bringing out a new emphasis by doing so. It might be that three stories have been gathered together in a certain section of the Gospel so that together they make a certain theological point, as in Luke chapter 15, where three parables are put together to illustrate God's joy when sinners repent. And then the other question we can conclude with is, what does it mean to have four Gospels, not one? I've already answered this in terms of how the Gospel is interpreted by each of the Gospel authors. And so what we get is the Gospel in stereo. We hear four different interpretations of the story of Jesus. Hence we have four Gospels in our New Testament canon. Well, this kind of a study is foundational for any further study you might do in the Gospels, where you would ask about similarities and differences in each story as you proceed. And so the next lecture will be a lecture on Mark's Gospel, with the assumption being that he wrote first.